Wow, that's a classic bit of 80s that. I mean, that reminds me of my childhood.
And I'm just standing there, and Dave is just totally ignoring me now.
Now, that's a room full of talent there. G'day, Nigel here. Welcome back to the Sax School Online podcast. Great to have you with me today, Fred. Obviously, really sad news about the passing of the legend David Sanborn recently. But you and I caught up at the end of your UK tour when you were touring around with Average White Band, and you were telling me some great stories about your experience of meeting David Sanborn. So jealous. It's something I never got a chance to do. So what was the first time that you did meet David?
Well, I'd seen him play a lot because I lived in the New York area, and obviously he was there. And that was at the time when there was a lot of live music in the clubs with all the studio musicians. So I got to see him a lot, but you might not realize this, but I'm actually very shy. And I never really had the guts to, I mean, there were times when I was standing outside a club in New York and he walked right by me and I just couldn't get the guts to say anything to him. And I regretted that because I'm like, I'm never going to get another chance. And I didn't do anything about it. And he walked into his car and drove off. But fortunately, the tour manager for the Average White Band, a guy named Willie Roach, who was our tour manager when I joined the Average White Band, became David Sanborn's tour manager. So then I had an instant in. I didn't have to worry about any of that stuff. And so anytime that I moved to it, I had moved to Atlanta, and anytime that Dave played in Atlanta, Willie would call me and said, come down to the show. And so I got to meet Dave probably 4 or 5 times, hang out with him 4 or 5 times. The first time, I sold merch for him. He was playing at the university, one of the universities, and I said, Willie, you don't have to do this. I'll go out and sell merch. So I got to sell, his CDs at the end of the show and hang out with him while he was signing and stuff like that. But Dave was the kind of guy where first of all, he was a very sweet guy, very unassuming, and all you had to do was mention reeds to him, like, hey, you have any problems with your reeds or whatever? And that was it. Like, we were off. We were, one time I went to see him and he had 2 guys from Georgia Tech, which is the big scientific university in Atlanta. And they were discussing how they were going to try to make synthetic reeds that Dave would be able to play, because he was constantly messing with reeds. And I was sitting in on that conversation because he was a nut for that kind of stuff. Like, he had a guy who would make his own reeds and fly them. Like, one time he had to fly them. They were in like Tahiti or something like that, and he had this guy fly to Tahiti to deliver his reeds. So yeah, he was definitely eccentric when it came to reeds, and he carried a leak light with him everywhere he went, and he would be messing with his horn up to the second he would go on stage. It was really, really obsessed with that kind of stuff. But the best story, I think, and the one that the guys in Average White Band constantly give me grief for is, my wife is from St. Louis, and Dave is from St. Louis. And when my wife met me, she didn't know anything about saxophone players. She was into banjo and guitar and literally kind of jangly music. But when she met me, she decided to do research on saxophone players. And one of the saxophone players that she did some research on was a guy named J.R. Montrose, who was a kind of not really well-known jazz player. And so when we met Sanborn, my wife was with me, and we're backstage before the show, and he kind of remembers me, like I'm a face that he sees like every, whenever he comes to town, but he doesn't quite know who I am, and then I have to remind him about Average White Band, and Average White Band and the Brecker Brothers had toured together, so he knew the guys in the band. So then I had like an instant, we talked about that. And anyway, so my wife went to parochial school, and one of her teachers grew up with Dave in Kirkwood, Missouri, which is a suburb of St. Louis. So, yes. And so that was the only sax player that she knew by name was David Sanborn, because this teacher used to say, I went, you might not know who he is, but I went to school with David, so she had this name, but she didn't know who he was. So they start talking about that. And then my wife tells Dave that she's been doing this research on these different saxophone players. And she mentions J.R. Montrose. And Dave just lit up, because he went to the University of Iowa and studied with J.R. Montrose. So now he and my wife are just gabbing away about J.R. Montrose, and then they're talking about J.R. Montrose. They're talking about growing up in St. Louis and the Gaslight District, which was the music district, and how everything has changed. And when I was there, and about her teacher in school, and I'm just standing there, and Dave is just totally ignoring me now. He doesn't care. I mean, he gave Lori, my wife, Lori, his phone number, and said, I really want to talk about this some more with you. So, call me and whatnot. And and then there's a great picture of my wife and Dave, but I have no picture with Dave. There's no pictures of me and David Sanborn. But so that's my, I just got totally shut out of the conversation at that point. That he couldn't care less. He couldn't care less about.
Wow, that's So the takeaway from that, really, Fred, is that you should have done the research paper on J.R. Montrose.
I guess so. That would have definitely helped. Yes.
It must have been amazing, though. You mentioned about growing up and being, when you were younger, being in New York and getting to see him play. And I guess, because you're a couple of years older than me, so you were, I guess, around when all of his career was taken off and it was all going crazy. I didn't actually discover David Sanborn as a player, like artist, as an artist and albums and all that sort of stuff. So I was actually at this university, at a music conservatorium, studying saxophone, because I grew up in a small town. I had very few records and access to things. I just didn't know about many people until I got to the Big Smoke, and then I started learning about people. So I was probably 18 or 19 or something. The first album that I remember coming across was Voyeur. That's like 1981, and I probably came across it in 1987, something like that. But it absolutely blew my mind. What was the first album that you remember, Fred?
It was 1975. I was a junior in high school, and really the only sax player that I had really gotten into prior to that was Tom Scott. And I was deep into Tom Scott. But when I heard the Taken Off album, which was Dave's first record for Warner Brothers, his first solo record, the first, we were talking about this before, the first three notes of that album, on the tune Butterfat, Dave just plays a little intro with just saxophone. Sounded like nothing I'd ever heard before, because his sound was so unique. It was almost like, is this a saxophone? It was so different than anybody that had come before him. My head exploded. And that whole record is great, and it's filled with, there's great songs on it. I was listening to it recently, and it doesn't feel dated to me. It's still really, it's the best musicians in the studio scene in New York playing on that record. And there's some great tunes. But his sound, it really was all about his sound more than anything else. For me, it was just so unique. And as much as I tried to duplicate it, I never even came close. Although it's still, to this day, I hear him in my head when I'm playing alto, even though I don't sound anything like him.
Yeah, I feel exactly the same, Fred. I mean, that was kind of when I heard that first Voyeur album, that was like, for me, it was the sound. There were three things, I suppose. There was the sound, there was the intention with which he played, because that's what, and I still love that one now when I listen to any of his stuff. It's the decisiveness of how he approaches the phrases and the articulation and just the energy. I absolutely love that. And the third thing is this, and I don't want this to sound the wrong way, but I love the simplicity of it. I love the fact that it's so powerful, but it's not always massively complicated melodically. And I love that, because when I first went off to study at this conservatorium, I was actually doing a classical degree. Although I was a jazz player at heart, and I loved doing jazz gigs. At that time in the 80s in Australia, doing a classical degree was kind of like the best option. So I was doing all this super complicated classical stuff, and then I discovered David Sanborn, and it's so powerful, and it reaches so many people, and yet in a way there's a simplicity to it, and that's always stayed with me in my mind as a sort of framework for how to play music that actually reaches people. And I love that. I have to say though, like I love that Voyeur album, but when the next one I heard was Up Front, which was so that was 1987. That probably came out around the same time that I discovered David Sanborn. It's like, that was the next album that came out. It was like, oh my God, like the people on the album, the tracks, the grooves. Yeah, absolutely amazing. I must have listened to that a million times. Do you remember that one?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, absolutely. I mean, everything about that record. I remember I remember hearing it on the radio. I remember hearing Snakes in my car on the radio and pulling the car over, no exaggeration, because I didn't even realize, it didn't even sound like him to me because it was such a different production, everything about it, the sound of the drums, the horns, everything about that, and the composition. It's a Marcus Miller produced record. And when I found out it was him, I had to, obviously rush out and buy it because every song on that record is great. And I had a band at that point that was doing like steady Thursday night gigs, and I transcribed every tune off that record, and we would play all of those songs in the band. That's definitely one of my favorite Sanborn records for a multitude of reasons. The other thing about Dave, I think, that made him so appealing, especially to saxophone players, alto saxophone players, is because of this simplicity is not quite the right word, I guess, but his vocabulary was a lot easier to master than Michael Brecker's. It was a totally different thing. It was so more blues based and I go visceral or whatever you want to call it, that he was kind of easy, deceptively, really, because not. But you would think you'd be able to cop his stuff because, it's just blues scales or whatever. But it wasn't. It was the way he played it with the sound and his feel and intent. And like you said, and the intent of it, you couldn't duplicate it. I've heard guys who people say, he sounds like, this guy sounds like David Sanborn. But nobody sounded like that. The combination of his melodic sense and just, it was just, it attacked you. It was so direct. That's the only word I can come up with that describes it.
Hey, real quick, if you're enjoying the podcast and you love learning how to play saxophone better, then be sure to follow this podcast wherever you're listening, just so you don't miss out on all of our amazing future episodes that we're busy working on for you. And hey, if you're feeling extra generous and you got a spare 5 seconds in your day, could you go and leave us a 5-star review? Honestly, you would be our number one most favorite person if you could do that. It would absolutely make our day. Thanks a bunch. Okay, let's get back to the episode. So something I'm curious to ask you about, Fred, is you mentioned about hearing him right from his very first album and, all those other albums that followed. I'm curious to know, when you saw David Sanborn when he was younger, right at the start of his career, his first album still has got all those characteristics that we're talking about. But when you saw him play live, did he also have that? Like, I'm wondering, what was the experience like of being in a small room and watching him play?
It was not disappointing. It was definitely not disappointing. He sounded like Dave Sanborn, and he always had like the best musicians, in his band. And it was live. He had the same energy. It's very similar. Like I said, I was very lucky because of where I lived that I got to hear him as often as I did. Even in the later years when he was living in Atlanta, he had a great band then, and that's like when I started to be able to hang out with him and his band. And I got to be good friends with a couple of the guys in his band, Ricky Peterson, who was the organ player. And, Ricky played on my record thanks to that, that connection. And, but yeah, he was a great performer live. I mean, he brought that energy whenever he was playing. And we haven't even really talked about what he brought to other people's records, and that it's possible. I don't know the dates, but his solo on, You Belong to Me, the Carly Simon tune that Michael McDonald and Carly wrote. That solo is so concise and right to the point and unbelievable. It's like it was written. I mean, it's just such a great solo. It's 8 bars or something, and it's so great that you can't play that song. Because I played that song with Michael when I did a little tour with Michael McDonald, and I was playing tenor on the gig for the most part, but on that song I couldn't not play alto, and I had to reference that solo because it's just a great solo. And he did that with so many other artists. And I was a serious record geek back then. And I read liner notes. So I would buy anything that I saw his name on. And sometimes it was, he would play 4 bars on something, but it was instantly identifiable and it was great. Always great. And he and Lou Marini were roommates in the Stan Kenton jazz camps, I found out.
Is that right? Wow. And because, mentioning Lou Marini, because you studied with Lou, right? Back when you were a youngster.
Yeah, I studied with Lou. Yeah. Yeah. And I remember kind of, saying to Lou, who is this guy? He was like, oh yeah, we were roommates in at the jazz camps, summer jazz camps.
Wow. Well, when they were teenagers, you mean?
Yeah. Yeah. Back when they were both, young, developing saxophone players.
Wow. Now that's a room full of talent there. So there's just such a legacy of recordings from David Sanborn. If you're new to exploring David Sanborn, then I'd definitely suggest the albums that you should go check out. The ones we've mentioned today. So the Voyeur album, Upfront, which is amazing. He did one with Bob James called Double Vision, which is amazing. Also, A Change of Heart. I love that one. And Straight to the Heart. That's like a classic. It's a little bit commercial, but I seem to find myself putting that one on quite a lot as well. So there's about 1 million years worth of practice just in those albums. What about you, Fred? What's your top albums to go check out?
Well, we talked about Upfront, which is great. Again, Taken Off. The first record is still, I still love that one. As We Speak, I got to talk about that just for 1 second because there's some great tunes on that, and Dave plays soprano on it, and he has a totally unique sound on soprano. Definitely worth checking that out. Upfront, yes, and the Lethal Weapon soundtrack with Eric Clapton is also, people have said that he is the third character in that movie, just musically what he adds to it. So that's a great one to check out as well. Lethal Weapon.
Wow, that's a classic bit of 80s that. I mean, that reminds me of my childhood. Absolutely. Oh, fantastic. Hey, I tell you what, Fred, we need to sit down and talk more about David Sanborn because I know we're both massive fans and I love hearing your stories. For those of you listening, thank you so much for joining us for this trip down memory lane together. If you are new to here, though, and you're enjoying the podcast, then please do subscribe on whatever platform you like to listen. And it would really help us out, actually, if you could share it with a friend, because we're trying to get the word out about the Sax School Online podcast, and your recommendation would really help us. And also, just before we go, don't forget, if you do want to check out how we're helping thousands of players every single day inside Sax School, then go grab that 14-day trial. We're very friendly. You'll get to get help from myself and Fred and all the rest of the tutors, plus access thousands of lessons, our structured courses, and connect with all of the live stream sessions that we're doing every single month. That's all available over at saxschoolonline.com. But for now, keep practicing hard. Go check out your David Sanborn albums and leave us a comment. Let me know what your favorites are. We'll catch you next time.